Well, I can see from that description, as usual, my big mouth precedes me. So thank you for coming out on a gray Armistice Day. Happy Armistice Day. Those that know me, he mentioned that, know that my weird hobby this time of year is I still broadcast Ouachita football games, going on about 40 years of doing that now. And so had our last game of the regular season, the big one, the Battle of the Ravine yesterday. But I was thinking driving over here on this anniversary, back in the 1920s, one of the ways that Little Rock celebrated Armistice Day is there would be a football game at Old Kavanaugh Field between Arkansas Tech and Ouachita on the afternoon of November the 11th during the 1920s. And they would take a chartered train full of Tech students and supporters from Russellville, and they would take a chartered train full of Ouachita supporters and students from Arkadelphia, and they would meet in Little Rock, and a lot of Little Rock people would turn out. And I've seen some old photos of those games. It was a big deal, drew big crowds. So I'm glad that tradition didn't continue, because I'd be calling a Ouachita Tech game this afternoon if it did, and wouldn't be able to visit with you. I'm going to try for just a few minutes, and then we'll go do the book signing. I'm going to try something that's pretty brash in itself, and that is, I'm in a room with professional historians, and I'm a rank amateur at this, but I'm going to try out an address that I gave to the board of the Federal Reserve Bank, and I'm not going to give you the actual address. I'm just going to tell you what I did. But I got an invitation back in the spring. The board of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis takes one of its quarterly meetings every year out to one of its districts. And so they only come to Arkansas once every 6 years. And so I had one of those assignments that probably everybody in this room's had something along these lines and that you really hate. They said to me, we would like you to speak at our opening dinner over at the Clinton Library before our board meetings begin the next day. And in essence, the assignment was, explain Arkansas to these people in 30 minutes or less. Now, I ran into a lot of that, and sometimes it was 2 minutes or less during Bill Clinton's 92 presidential campaign, because at that time I was political editor of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, and our clerks in the newsroom back then had a bad habit of, if they heard the word Clinton, they'd just transfer the call to my direct line. And so what you had is you had a lot of reporters from around the world, literally, coming in here, and they were wanting you to explain this place, Arkansas. And again, as you all already know, given hours, given days, given weeks, Arkansas, being the unique place that it is not really easy to explain to outsiders. So my goodness, how do you do that in 30 minutes or less? So I came up with a title called A State of Disaster. And I have used this talk on some Arkansas groups since then, and I always say to them, I said, don't get upset if you were born and raised here like I was, because the story does have a happy ending. But as I tried to boil it down, and again, like I said, I'm taking a risk because I'm dealing with you historians on this very complex subject, but you're trying to boil it down in a few minutes. So as I tried to boil down about 200 years of Arkansas history, I decided that we could best be defined by a series of natural and man-made disasters that really held back the growth and development of Arkansas. And where I started in a state of disaster was 1811, 1812, and those would be the New Madrid earthquakes, the first big natural disaster that I started with. And late 1811, early 1812. As you know, there was one really big earthquake. That was the one where they claimed the Mississippi River ran backwards in spots. You could hear church bells ringing as far away as Washington, D.C., and it was the largest earthquake ever recorded in this country. But there was a whole series. There were earthquakes before the big one, there were earthquakes after the big one, but the net effect is that as the westward expansion of the United States was beginning, it made Arkansas, which was already a dang difficult place to get into, even more difficult to get into. I mean, already if you look at the eastern border of Arkansas. It was impenetrable bottomland hardwood forest and swamps. And what the New Madrid earthquakes did was basically drop tens of thousands of acres of trees, caused land to sink in places. So it made it even harder to get through those forests, and it created even more swamps. If you go up into northeast Arkansas, the Big Lake area of Mississippi County, I just spent the night in Manila earlier this fall, and I'm always fascinated by Big Lake because it's really as close to the Everglades as you can get in the state of Arkansas. Only about 3 feet deep, giant lily pads out there. Actually use airboats on Big Lake, created by the New Madrid earthquakes. You have the St. Francis Sunken Lands in Poinsett County also. So first great natural disaster, meaning that as the western expansion, like I said, I'm just telling you how I boiled this down quickly. As the western expansion happened, it just became much easier to go north to Missouri or south to Louisiana. And Arkansas was a difficult place to get into. So that was the first of my natural disasters that I tried out on them. The first of my man-made disasters, and we certainly had plenty of man-made mistakes between 1812 and 1861, but for the essence of time, the first of my great man-made disasters that I then used on them was, of course, the decision to secede from the Union. And again, I'm with a learned group here, so you obviously realize that, but I explained to audiences from outside the state that it wasn't a given that Arkansas would secede, because we had, of course, large parts of our state covered by mountains, the Ouachita Mountains, the Ozark Mountains, no large-scale cotton farming operations in those areas. There were slave owners in those mountain counties, but they tended to be outnumbered by non-slave owners and people with strong Union sentiment. So Arkansas, after 7 states seceded pretty quickly, was one of those 4 holdouts, along with Tennessee, which was a mountain state like Arkansas, along with North Carolina, which was a mountain state like Arkansas, and along with Virginia, interestingly enough, even though it would become the capital of the Confederacy when it moved from Montgomery to Richmond, having West Virginia initially, again, a lot of mountain areas, a lot of Union sentiment. And you look back, it's one of those 2020 things, but how much greater off would Arkansas have been if we had made the decision of border states like Missouri and Kentucky to stay in the Union rather than fighting on the losing side of that battle. So man-made disaster there. And so we suffer the ravages of the war. We suffer the ravages as a state of reconstruction after the war. And then, as you can see, in about 5 to 10 minutes, I had that audience already up to the 1900s. So it was the fastest history lesson that they had ever had of Arkansas. But quickly explain again how in those years after the Civil War that Arkansas was really exploited during the late 1800s, during the early 1900s by large timber operations, most of them owners from the north that came into Arkansas to exploit the natural resources here, and by the railroads, again, with most of the ownership of the railroads being from out of state. So in that sense, we were that colony, that almost third world colony, where all of our resources were being taken out and not a lot was being put into the state. So as I brought this group in up until the 1900s, I walked them through a very quick succession of disasters. The Great Flood of 1927, of course. Out-of-state people tend to be familiar, a lot of them, with the flood, but because of what they've read, John Barry's Rising Tide, because of what they've watched a PBS documentary here and there, they think more of New Orleans because it was the biggest city in the region. They think more of Mississippi because Mississippi had a much larger population at that time than Arkansas did. And they don't realize that Arkansas had more land underwater and more people displaced than any other state by the Great Flood of 1927. So we were affected more adversely than any other state. And then you explain to them right on the heels of that, along came the start of the Great Depression in 1929. Arkansas, already a very poor state, we're affected as much, if not more, than other states by the Great Depression. I mean, this was a state where you literally had people starving during the early years of the Great Depression. And then along comes, and this has not been written about as much, of course, as the Great Flood of 27, but the Great Drought of 1930-31. So it wouldn't stop raining in 1927. It wouldn't rain at all in 1930-31, and that's when a lot of people in this farming state decided it's time to start getting out. This is really not a very good place to make a living. And again, during this point, I tell them, these out-of-state visitors, that John Steinbeck made the Okies famous with the grapes of wrath, but there were a lot of Arkies too. My great-grandfather on my father's side went to California during this period. My grandmother, who lived to 98 years old in Benton, I remember had this photo of his gravesite in an orange grove, actually, in California, and she'd say, "Oh, I'd love to see my daddy's grave." Well, she wouldn't fly, and frankly, none of us were going to drive her to California, so she never got to do that. But one of my own family members, my great-grandfather, was one of the Arkies that headed out. And then you again tell them that there was another great flood in 1937 that affected large parts of Arkansas. 3 foot high and rising, Johnny Cash, based on the flood of 1937. 1927 Great Flood, started the Great Depression. 1930-31 Great Drought. 1937 you have the Great Flood there. So again, you've got these natural disasters piling on each other, and people are streaming out of Arkansas. And then, of course, came World War II, and I walked the group through, whereas other areas pulled out of the Great Depression, thanks to the buildup to the war and the war itself, whereas other areas, their economies really took off. Again, coming back to this farming state of Arkansas, the population loss here actually increased due to the mechanization of agriculture. Leading up to the war, all that research and development affected every industry in the country. Agriculture was one of them. Along came the mechanical cotton picker. Along came improved seed varieties. Along came improved insecticides. Along came improved herbicides. And so, if you owned land, that was a good thing. If before the war you had a cotton plantation in East Arkansas and it took 200 sharecroppers to raise a crop of cotton, you were probably able to do that with 20 people soon after the war due to these advances. And now you can farm that same amount of land, of course, with 2 to 3 people and achieve record yields. So Arkansas continues to bleed population, going from 7 congressional seats at one time down to 4 House seats, where we still are at this point. So our population bleed continues from the 40s into the 1960s. And as Arkansans find out, there's not work on the farm, but by golly, there is work in Chicago, there is work in Detroit, there is work in Gary, Indiana, because the steel industry was booming after the war. People were buying automobiles, the automobile industry was booming, and they could find work. Obviously, you add the evils of segregation to that loss of work on the farm, and Arkansas was a key state in the great migration of African Americans to those northern states. So, again, I've walked my group now through from 1811, natural disasters. I did the man-made disaster in 1861, and of course we've got another man-made disaster coming up that I explained to them. And where I slow down a little bit in talking about the population loss was how Arkansans had really become so concerned by that population loss by 1954 that they did something very different. And that is, we had pretty almost a custom in this state at a time when we had 2-year terms for governor, that we would elect a man governor, and if he did a decent job, we would elect him to a second 2-year term, and you'd serve 4 years as governor. And we were so desperate by 1954 that we didn't give poor old Francis Cherry from Jonesboro his second 2-year term as governor. We instead, I think in an early Arkansas version of the Trump revolution, and by that I mean that's voters saying, let's try something very different, let's try something very extraordinary, and that was to get this populist, some say a socialist, his father of course was an avowed socialist, Orville Eugene Faubus from Madison County, the hills of the Ozarks. Let's put him in and let's try something completely different, because what we're doing didn't work. So we elect Faubus in 54. In 1955, one of the first bills pushed through by the Faubus administration is a bill creating the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission, AIDC, now AEDC, and we began an effort as a state to try to replace those lost jobs on the farm with manufacturing jobs. We do what many southern states were doing at the time. We go to the upper Midwest, we go to the Northeast, and we say, bring your shoe factory here, bring your cut and sew operation here, because we've got good, hardworking people, but we don't have unions. So your cost of labor is going to be much less. And again, we achieved some success at that. When I was growing up in Arkadelphia, we made bras at Hollywood Vassarette. We made work clothes at Oberman. We made jeans at Levi's. Those jobs all, of course, long gone. Out of the country, but you can still drive around Arkansas and towns all over. You can find that old abandoned factory on the edge of town that used to be the shirt factory or used to be the shoe factory, and that came back to that era in the 50s. Now, Faubus was smart in respect that he saw that we had an asset, and that is a member of America's richest family, the Rockefeller family, had moved to Arkansas in 1953. Winthrop had come here to get away from the paparazzi and his headaches in New York. Yes, they did have paparazzi in the early 1950s, and his old war buddy had said, you know, they're chasing you around, saying you're chasing women, saying you're drinking too much, Winthrop. You got to get as far away from the Manhattan social scene as you possibly can get. And what was as far away from the Manhattan social scene as you possibly could get in 1953? Probably a little poor state called Arkansas. And so, of course, Rockefeller comes here. He's named the first chairman of AIDC. We again achieve some success from an economic standpoint as some of those plants start moving here. And then, John, you're probably cringing. I'm taking something complicated and, like I said, in this fast address, bringing it down. But then the next of our great man-made disasters, because of course Faubus decides to go against that grain that I'd earlier explained, and that is 2-2-year terms. We had given Faubus his first term in 54. We had returned to normal, given him that second term in 56, but he decides, you know, I like this governor's gig. It beats being a newspaper editor in Huntsville. Got a state trooper driving me around. I live in a governor's mansion, got people that cook. So I'm gonna run for a third term. Pretty unusual in Arkansas. So I'm gonna run for a third term in 58. So I've got to make a political calculation here. Now, politically it was right. Morally is a different story, and what it did to Arkansas economically, of course, was a different story. And that, of course, was the decision to block the entrance of the 9 black students into Little Rock Central High School in the fall of 1957. And again, as you know, the Little Rock Central desegregation crisis becomes the largest, biggest news story in the world in the fall of 57. The rest of that story that's not often reported is, of course, it again set economic development in Arkansas back by decades. So at that point, I've walked them through a whole series, as you can see now, of natural disasters, from the pneumatic earthquakes of 1811, 1812, to the Great Flood of 27, the drought of 30-31, the flood of 37, to man-made disasters such as the decision to secede, the decision to instigate the Little Rock Central desegregation crisis. And you've got a state that's been slow to grow and actually during much of the early 1900s has been losing population. So there ends the disaster point, and then I point out that the state actually has been gaining population now since the 1960s. And in an effort to simplify things again, for a 30-minute address, I actually landed on 4 things that I thought turned that around. 2 were on the government side and 2 were over on the private sector side. On the government side, the first of the things that I think that helped turn that around was, and again I'm speaking personally, but I think ever since the aforementioned Winthrop Rockefeller was elected governor in '66, we've had a pretty good run of governors in this state for 52 years now. Counting our current governor, who of course was just reelected last week, we've had 5 Democrats and we've had 4 Republicans. So we've had governors in both political parties. But my sense of it is that they have governed pretty much alike. They have governed as pragmatists. They may have spoken a little differently on the national stage, but as far as the way they govern, we hadn't had anybody over here on the far right. We haven't had anybody over here on the far left. We've got a scandal in our legislative branch right now, but also the executive branch has been pretty clean, pretty free of scandal. Unlike states like, say in Illinois, where it seems like you're going to federal prison the day you leave the governor's office. That's got to been the history there. But Arkansas, pretty clean in the executive branch, pragmatist governing. Asa Hutchinson, frankly, governs about like Mike Beebe governed. Mike Beebe governed, frankly, about like Mike Huckabee governed. Mike Huckabee governed, he probably wouldn't want me saying this after working for him for 10 years, but the way he governed about like Jim Guy Tucker and Bill Clinton governed. So a Rockefeller is elected in 1966 after failing to beat Faubus in '64. Rockefeller is elected. The Democrats, of course, in '66 run an arch segregationist and Justice Jim Johnson. He gets beat. Rockefeller becomes the first elected Republican governor since Reconstruction. Democrats still don't learn their lesson, so in '68 they go back to the so-called old guard and they nominate Marion Crank out of Foreman, and he gets beat too. So Faubus makes the decision he's going to be the returning savior in 1970, and what was then by far the state's majority party, its voters finally come to their senses in '70 and said, you know, we tried Justice Jim in '66 and it didn't work. We tried Marion Crank in '68 and it didn't work. Do we go back to Faubus? Because Rockefeller's running for a 3rd term here, even though his heart really wasn't in it. By that time, his supporters had talked him against his own inclination to run again in 1970. And so, of course, Dale Bumpers comes out of nowhere, 1% name recognition at most, probably, at the start of the campaign, only previous office being, of course, the Charleston School Board. Bumpers is elected in '70, and so in that sense, it took a Rockefeller to make a Bumpers possible, to make a David Pryor possible, and yes, to make a Bill Clinton possible. So pretty good run of governors since that '66 decision to elect Winthrop Rockefeller by Arkansas voters rather than Justice Jim Johnson. Pretty good run for about a half century. Very unusual for a state this small to have that long a run of pragmatic, really good governors, people on the national stage who present themselves well. The other thing on the government side we had going for us is when we began to turn around the population losses and gain population in the '60s, of course, we had this incredibly strong congressional delegation. I mean, at one time, 3 of what arguably are the 10 most powerful committees of Congress, all controlled by Arkansans. Wilbur Mills, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, John L. McClellan, chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so because of that, again, we're able to get things to Arkansas that would have never been possible. I can point first to these large Corps of Engineers impoundments all over the state, from Bull Shoals and Beaver in the north part of the state to Greeson to Ouachita to DeGray. I can go on and on. I can look out the window here and see the McClellan-Kerr Arkansas River Navigation System, which at the time it was completed was the most expensive civil works project in the history of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that came from pure political power. So a good run of governors, a strong congressional delegation at the point we started turning things around, and then of course over on the private side, this amazing group of homegrown entrepreneurs that just tended to come along basically during the same period in Arkansas history. Such a small state. I know we all love the connections here. My dad graduates from Ouachita in 1948. He's a little older because he had been a bombardier on a B-17 during World War II, so he's 24. And his first job out of college is he is hired as head football coach at Newport High School. And those of you from small town Arkansas like me know that's a big deal when you got a new high school football coach. So the guy that runs the Ben Franklin store hears that my dad is a big quail hunter. He's a big quail hunter too. And Sam Walton that ran Ben Franklin starts taking my dad quail hunting. And it was a joke in our family to the day my father passed away, like, couldn't you have kept that relationship going? At least exchange Christmas cards or something? We might have bought some of that initial public offering, and I probably wouldn't be here today had we done that. But my dad would always say, I didn't know what happened to him when he left Newport. And of course, you all know what happened to him. He lost his lease on the Ben Franklin store in booming Newport. So he goes up to that poor, struggling corner of the state called Northwest Arkansas. Because of course, you couldn't grow cotton very well up there. Who would want to live in Northwest Arkansas? All they grew up there were rocks and cedar trees, and the rest of that is history. J.B. Hunt also starts over on the eastern side of the state, hauling rice hulls for Producers Rice Mill at Stuttgart. There's business in the chicken industry in Northwest Arkansas, creates the largest trucking firm in America. You can go on and on. We lived in a state for many years. I was talking about a poor farming state where chickens, those were what ran around the front yard and ate bugs and worms. And I'm sure people said, nobody's ever going to become a multimillionaire raising chickens. They had never heard of the Tyson family in those days. Bill Dillard starts his first store down at Nashville in Howard County, decides to go a little bigger and moves over to Texarkana. The Murphys are homegrown in El Dorado in the oil industry. So again, during that period, we have taking off this amazing group of entrepreneurs, all homegrown. And I love my friends that are in economic development, but the fact is all of our great companies in Arkansas aren't something we went to another state. We read so much about tax incentives and so forth, but think about the history of Arkansas. They aren't something we went to another state, offered incentives, and somebody moved here. I mean, they were homegrown. So you had that turned around. Now, I broke out a fourth category when I gave this speech to the Federal Reserve Bank, because I figure they certainly know banking and finance better than I do. And afterwards they said that needs to be a separate category. And here was the separate category. The separate category were these two old boys from the pine woods of Grant County, Prattsville to be exact, Whit and Jack Stevens, because as a couple of these people on the Federal Reserve Board said, what Arkansas had that most states didn't have, it had had these two guys that built what at one time was the largest investment bank in the country that wasn't headquartered on Wall Street. They had not only the capital, but the financial know-how to take a germ of an idea like a Walmart, to take a germ of an idea like a Tyson, and take it public, and by taking it public, allow it to move to the next level. So I broke that into a separate category because they really helped the entrepreneurs I was talking about move to the next level. So you've got the Stevens as our fourth category. So strong governor, strong congressional delegation, amazing entrepreneurs, and then some guys with the ability to take those entrepreneurs' ideas and take them to the next level. And we have been gaining population now since the 1960s after about, again, 200 years or so of man-made and natural disasters. Now, and this is another talk for another day, but I think the most undercovered story in Arkansas right now, and I think the most interesting story to me going forward, is the demographic revolution in our state. And demographics in this sense, I don't mean how much you make or what your race is or how old you are, I mean where you live. And of course, because of the mechanization of agriculture, since at least the 1950 census, we've been seeing a shift in the population base of this state from south and east to north and west. But that has actually sped up since the turn of the century. If you read the story about Pine Bluff on the front page of today's newspaper, just since the 1980 census, they've fallen from near 60,000 to 42,000 as a city. From 2000 to 2010, Carrie and I were talking about Monroe County. Monroe County lost 21% of its population. That has continued, so the population loss since the turn of the century in Monroe County, which is Brinkley, Elaine, is probably now 25% or higher. That's 1 in every 4 people. That's staggering when you think about it in that quick of a time. So from the 2000 census to the 2010 census, we were basically 2 states within a state. 39 counties gained population, 36 counties lost population. Now we're a couple of years away from the 2020 census, but because I'm weird and I like to follow county population patterns, I can almost guarantee you that when the 2020 census comes along, just as was the case in 2010, we will have gained population as a state between 2010 and 2020, but a majority of Arkansas counties will have lost population. It's going to be 41, 42, or 43. I think our 75 counties will have lost population. In essence, what you have is you have 3 growth areas in Arkansas. You have Northwest Arkansas, and there are some exceptions here and there, but you have Northwest Arkansas generally. You've got the Little Rock metropolitan area, more so the counties around Pulaski County than Pulaski County itself. And then you've got that Jonesboro to Paragould corridor, Craighead and Greene County, that are doing pretty well. Other than that, you've got counties that are really struggling just to hold their own, and you've got some that are bleeding population. So I think that's the biggest story going forward, and probably one as a newspaper we don't write enough about. So that was my quick version of Arkansas history, the state of disaster, and then how we turned it around. And that's what I try out on out-of-state audiences. And I'll shut up now, but I would welcome any feedback or questions or comments if anybody's got any.